Welcome to the second part of Europe, Russia and gas, where we discuss the dependence between Europe and Russia. If you haven't watched part 1, you can follow the link attached. But let me summarize where we are. In part 1, I described how Europe has a large problem. It wants to put pressure on Mr. Putin's government in response to the invasion of Ukraine. At the same time, Europe cannot cut its dependence on Russian gas because that's where the majority of imports come from, mostly through existing pipelines. Every day, the European Union is paying 400 million euros to the Kremlin to buy its gas. No country can immediately replace the 185 billion cubic meters that Europe is currently importing every year from Russia. But in part 1, I also briefly mentioned how Russia stopped its sales of gas to two countries in the European Union, Poland and Bulgaria. We need to see how this fits into the entire story. In part 1, we asked, can Europe live without Russian gas? Now join me in part 2, where we will ask the opposite question. Can Russia live without European demand? Let's start with the economic sanctions imposed on Mr. Putin's government after the invasion of Ukraine. Many of the sanctions have cut Russia from parts of the global financial system. This is making it harder for Russia to access hard currency, dollars or euros. So a few weeks ago, Russia demanded that unfriendly countries pay for their imports in rubles. This would allow Russia to bypass existing sanctions while at the same time strengthen its currency. Russia made this demand and set a deadline for countries to comply. The deadline passed, but European countries didn't comply. So Gazprom, the Russian gas giant, made a very controversial decision. It stopped selling gas to Poland and Bulgaria. This move is unprecedented. The immediate impact will be limited because both Poland and Bulgaria are relatively small buyers, and actually both countries are finding ways to cope. Poland will be able to import gas from Norway, and Bulgaria will replace imports with gas from Azerbaijan via Greece. But this has raised the stakes for everybody. The energy ministries in Europe are asking uncomfortable questions. How much can Europe cope with this? Will Russia stop selling to other countries too? I mean, putting the Ukraine invasion to one side, if Europe needed a reason to get itself off its dependence of Russian gas, this would be it. This goes beyond preparing for the next winter. This is about long-term energy security. Dependence cuts both ways. Yes, Europe needs Russian gas, but Russia needs Europe too. Remember, it is harder to move gas than it is to move oil. If Europe imposed an embargo on Russian oil, Russia could redirect its shipments to Asia, for example to China. But it would be much harder to do this with gas. First, there are not enough pipelines moving east, and Russia does not have enough liquefaction capacity to be able to shift to LNG all the gas that it currently sells in Europe. Building pipelines and LNG facilities would take years. Let's look at Russia's numbers. Russia exported 240 billion cubic meters of gas in 2020. The large majority was by pipeline, of which 85% went to Europe. 13% went to neighboring countries such as Belarus, and only 2% went to China. Over the years, pipelines were built to connect to the west, to Europe, not to the east. Russia can export some LNG, some of which already goes to Asia, but it is small, representing no more than 10 or 20% of exports. Therefore, Russia definitely needs Europe. This is what makes it so baffling that Mr. Putin stopped sales of gas to countries in the European Union. It is certainly a way to put immediate pressure, but Gazprom is breaking contracts and is affecting its reputation as a reliable supplier in the future. If Gazprom decided to cut supply of gas to other countries, for example Germany, it would raise the stakes enormously. This situation would greatly affect the German economy, of course, but again, it would affect Russian revenues too. Gas prices have gone crazy. There's been a lot of volatility, with prices reaching record highs. Gazprom can take advantage of the revenues generated by those high prices, but most of those sales would have to go to Europe, so it cannot shoot itself in the foot. So here we are. Europe considers an embargo, Russia considers cutting off sales unless paid in rubles. The two sides are aiming at each other. Who will blink first? Now there are ways to unlock this. Let's look at some possibilities from Europe's perspective. First, in the short term, Europe could pump more gas from existing non-Russian pipelines, for example from Norway or Azerbaijan. It's a little bit, but it would help. At the same time, Europe could maximize the use of regasification terminals to receive additional LNG from North America or Qatar. Warmer weather now means Europe can buy throughout the summer in order to build inventory before next winter. According to the consultancy Rystad Energy, Europe could compensate about 60% of potential lost supply from Russia. It's a good effort, but it's not enough. It still means trouble in the short term. Europe could also consume less. High energy prices lead to cuts in demand. But there are limits to this. Even during the pandemic, throughout all of 2020, global energy demand only fell by about 5%. And it is ironic that as the world economy was starting to recover, additional pressure of high energy prices is having a negative impact. Europe's best options are in the long term. They will take time, but they will reduce dependence on Russia. Europe could build more LNG capacity to diversify supply. The United States, Qatar, Australia, they are expanding liquefaction capacity, so more LNG will be available in the coming years. And there are other technologies that will grow over time. For example, there are floating storage and regasification units, or FSRUs, which are ships that can regasify while they are on the water, and they can feed gas into the grid directly. They add flexibility and reduce the need to build regasification plants onshore. Another technology is called floating LNG, which can produce LNG in the middle of the ocean. These structures are amazing, with a length of almost 500 meters. There will be more of them in the future. Europe could also produce more gas. There's a possibility to produce shale gas in countries like the UK, the Netherlands, Germany, and Poland. But shale and fracking are controversial, and permits have been very limited. But remember, the United States went from being a net importer to a net exporter in less than 10 years thanks to this technology. But the best alternative is to switch to other sources of energy. Remember that much of the gas is used to produce electricity. We can substitute that electricity with other sources, including solar, wind, and nuclear power. We are already electrifying some of the transportation and some of the heating. We will still need gas, but the current crisis will push the energy transition so that we can decentralize and decarbonize while helping reduce global warming. This is when a combination of necessity, ingenuity, and technology can help us shape a different world. But all of this takes time. There's another option that could come into place relatively quickly. Europe could impose tariffs on Russian sales of oil and gas. This would have several effects. First, a tariff would make Russian gas more expensive. In the short term, that would mean higher prices for consumers. But as the market adjusts and other sources of gas become available, Russian gas would have to reduce its price to compete. In some ways, a tariff would be better than an embargo because it would not stop the flow of Russian gas into the market, but it would reduce the amount of money flowing into the coffers of the Kremlin. Second, a tariff could provide economic incentives to importers and consumers to help justify investments in LNG or other energy sources. Third, some of the money from the tariffs could ironically make its way back to Ukraine in the form of aid or relief to compensate for the damage caused by Mr. Putin in the first place. This proposal is currently under discussion. European governments are pondering the advantages and disadvantages. So let's bring everything together. We know that Europe cannot reduce its dependence on Russian gas immediately. We also know that Russia needs to continue selling to Europe. And yet we now know that Europe actually has some options. They will take time, investment, and political will, but in the longer term, they could make Europe less dependent, more flexible, and cleaner. But how did we get here in the first place? How could Europe allow such a large dependence on a single supplier? To answer this question, we need to go back to the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union. Back in those days, European countries were making an effort to integrate Russia via trade, which sounded like a good idea at the time. It would provide Europe with the energy it needed, and it would help Russia grow and integrate faster into the global economy. Trade and economic cooperation can help countries grow together and reduce excuses for aggression. Germany was particularly keen on doing this. Even before the fall of the Berlin Wall, the phrase Wandel durch Handel, pardon my German, or change through trade, was common in German politics. That was the plan, and it made sense. But the world is complicated. 25 years later, Mr. Putin is using energy as a tool to bully, manipulate, and intimidate not only its neighbors, but also its commercial partners. I still believe the move by Mr. Putin and Gazprom was reckless. The long-term consequences of launching this invasion, breaking gas contracts, threatening partners will only be detrimental to Russia in the future. Yes, the country is vast, and it has a lot of raw materials, but the economy is not that big. It ranks between Brazil and South Korea. The economic upheaval will only make things worse. Anyway, now we know. The dependence between Europe and Russia cuts both ways. The stakes are high. The options are on the table. We'll see what happens. I hope you enjoyed this video. Now we have the complete picture. We know about European demand. We know about Russian supply. Click on the link if you have never seen part 1 of this story. Can Europe live without Russian gas? You can also see my previous video on Russian oil by clicking on the link in the description below. And feel free to leave your comments, click like, subscribe, whatever you want. I'll see you next time.